My name is Hank Clark. I'm program coordinator of the Political Economy Project, and on behalf of the PEP and our friends and colleagues in the Department of Sociology, it's really a pleasure to welcome you all here today. You can consult our website for future events starting tomorrow. We've got 5 or 6 events, public events left in the spring term. But I want to get straight to today's event. It's a real treat to have Brooke Harrington with us. She probably needs no introduction for most of you. She's had teaching and research appointments at Brown University, the Max Planck Institute in Cologne, and the Copenhagen School of Business, as well as here at Dartmouth College, where she's now a full professor in the Department of Sociology. She's the author of the numerous books, mostly on finance, such as Capital Without Borders, as well as the more recent 2024 Norton book, Offshoring. She's a star from the Jon Stewart Daily Show as well. But let me just let the record show that we placed our invitation with her before Jon Stewart discovered her, so I don't want there to be any confusion about that. We've been trying for quite a while to arrange a mutually agreeable time between the PEP and Brooke, so it's great that we finally found one, and I would say it's perhaps the perfect moment for her to discuss the topic we're here to discuss today. So without any further ado, won't you please join me in welcoming Brooke Harrington.
Thank you for coming to see me on a rainy afternoon when you can be cuddled up under a duvet somewhere instead. How many of you here are in Professor Clark's class or otherwise associated with the Political Economy Project? Yeah. Well, okay. How many of you know what sociology is or have ever taken a sociology class? Hey, that's what I'm talking about. Nice. This is the point where I have to, in the name of full transparency, tell you 2 things that are important. One is I never took a sociology class when I was an undergraduate. I was an English major. And I didn't get into Dartmouth as an undergraduate. I had to go to the Dartmouth of the West, Stanford University. And only later in my life, after working for several years in the Silicon Valley, among other things, did I discover sociology and why it was useful. So part of my mission is sort of quasi-evangelical here, which is to explain to you why I think sociology is actually very, very useful. And I always ask people if they know what sociology is, because I just had a funny experience about a month ago with one of my own co-authors. Who here knows Dan Rockmore? Former chair of the computer science department, generally extremely smart person. He's been my collaborator and co-author for 3 years. We write papers together, we publish together. He's met with me a couple weeks ago and said, I don't really understand what sociology is. So I figure if someone as smart as Dan Rockmore needs to ask that question, I should make clear what the point of this whole field is. I'm an economic sociologist, which means all the stuff that you learn about in economics and you think, that doesn't correspond very well to the real world as I know it, or economics doesn't cover at all some things I want to know about. That's what economic sociology does. We pick up all the stuff that's crazy about what people do with money and investing, and we study that part. So what I'm going to tell you about is how I've spent the last almost 20 years, probably as long as some of you have been alive in this room, studying a very secretive part of the world of economic sociology, which is called offshore finance. How many of you know what offshore finance is? You're about to find out, if you don't know. Ha, Luke, he's my plant in the audience here. He's survived 2 classes with me, and we're about to do some more research together. Thanks for coming. So, offshore finance. Sometimes when I meet people and they find out what I study, they're like, but wait, you're a sociologist. why don't economists do all this? And the answer is they do, but they do a different part of the same phenomenon. You know, there's an old story about three blind men encountering an elephant. One of them has the elephant by the leg, another has the elephant by the tail, and another has the elephant by the trunk. And they each describe what they're feeling, and each of their descriptions is true, but incomplete. Offshore finance is a lot like that. So, my contention overall is that this thing called the offshore financial system, which I'm about to tell you about, is sort of the Rosetta Stone to understanding why the rich keep getting richer and the poor keep getting poorer, not just here, but all over the world. And why political inequality seems to be going in the same direction. That there are lots of nominal democracies in the world, but very few of them seem to be functioning as intended. So what economists tell us, and here I'm talking about people like Gabriel Zuckman or Thomas Piketty, whom you may have heard of, they study the offshore financial world, and they're really good at imputing what is effectively a whole world of missing data. Because the offshore financial system is a world of secrecy. You can't really know how much money is out there, but their best guess is that 12 trillion US dollars worth of private household is out there. And in case you're wondering how much that is 12% of global product. All the economic effort in the entire world for 1 year, 12% of that, as a minimum, is offshore. And that's just the part that belongs to individuals. There's a whole other set of offshore activity that belongs to corporations. We don't know how much of their money is often in the offshore financial system. But the economist's best estimate, their low estimate, is that the private use of offshore finance costs governments of the world about 110 billion in taxes every year. That's a lot of roads and hospitals and schools that should have gotten built but never did. And then corporations' use of offshore finance costs another 500 billion annually in taxes that government pay. And this is without breaking the law in most cases. That's a whole other subject. So I promised I would tell you what offshore finance is. If you ask an economist, they're interested in the tax part of it pretty much exclusively. So if you've ever heard the term tax havens, that is sometimes used synonymously with offshore financial centers. I prefer offshore financial centers for a variety of reasons, including the fact that the biggest users by volume of this system are from countries that don't impose taxes. Countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. They have lots of other reasons to want to hide their assets, but they have nothing to do with taxes. There's a group of people you may know about called economic geographers. They have a really cool job in which they try to map the international networks of these capital flows, including secret capital flows in the offshore system. So when you ask them what's offshore finance, they say, well, it's this financial network inhabited by elites, and we can map some of their comings and goings. If you ask a political scientist, they might say, well, it's a zone of elite political contestation, where the richest people in the world basically pummel democracy into submission, and they distort the workings of capitalism, so it just keeps pouring money into their pockets at the expense of everyone else. Now, all of the above is true, kind of like the blind men with the elephant. What sociology adds to the conversation is the view from 30,000 feet, where we look at the whole system, or the whole elephant, and say, offshore finance is a social technology that produces secrecy. And it's the secrecy that underwrites all of the other stuff that the economists, economic geographers, and political scientists are finding. So what I want to talk to you about is this secrecy and how it gets made. And I know about it because I trained to be an offshore wealth manager, because that was the only way to study these people. They don't take calls from nosy sociologists. You gotta join them. So, once upon a time, there was a German sociologist named Georg Simmel, and way back in 1906, he published this really famous article that you've either read if you've taken a sociology course, or you will have to read if you get a master's or a PhD in sociology. And he says, both aristocracies and criminal gangs depend on secrecy for approximately the same reasons. they do all kinds of stuff that if the public knew about it, there would be pitchforks and torches in the street. So it has to be kept on the down low. And the kicker of this very long article is if you want to understand inequality, political and economic, you have to understand how secrecy is produced in society. Everyone who gets a PhD in sociology has to confront this work, and then they promptly forget about it, because secrecy is really hard to study, and hardly anybody does research on it, because it's secret. So it reminds me a lot of the old map makers of the early days of the age of exploration. I'll show you a picture in a minute, but you've probably seen examples of these old maps where they had very distorted images of the world that left out whole continents because the people making the maps just hadn't found those places yet. So I think we're kind of at that stage now where global map makers were 500 or 600 years ago, where we know, for example, a little bit about how much money there is in this offshore financial system. We know a little bit about where it is. But we don't know very much about who made it that way and how they made it. We need to know about mechanisms and agency. If you want to stop this stuff, you can't just observe that it exists. You have to find out, how did it get that way? Who made it that way? Then you can start to implement some policies that might work to stop it, or at least slow it down. So that's been my job since 2007, when I first launched this project, thinking that I was merely going to find the headwaters of global economic inequality. So I think where we are on the subject of offshore finance across the social science disciplines, economics, poli-sci, economic geography, and sociology, is kind of where map makers were in about 1493. This is one of my favorite maps. It's called the Nuremberg Chronicle. And you can see that they made it in Nuremberg, Germany. And it shows a map of the world that has, well, you can see it's missing quite a lot. There's no India, for example. There's no North or South America. There's no Antarctica. That thing on the upper right could conceivably be part of Western China, but no one's really sure. One day, we will look back at what we know in 2025 about the offshore financial system and kind of giggle at it, the way we look at these maps, like, oh, isn't it cute, they thought they know something. But we're still finding out, and that's kind of what makes it a fun adventure. Now, here's where we get to the news, as you might see it on television or in the paper. Do any of you recognize these characters here? I just pulled a few photos from the Panama Paradise and Pandora papers. Do those terms ring any bells for you? I think some people in this room might have been in elementary school when the Pandora and Panama papers came out. Those things I just named, the various papers, are leaks of secret offshore data. They're why we know very much about offshore finance. They're private files belonging to ultra-rich people that were released by whistleblowers within the offshore financial services industry to journalists. And some of that information has been made public, and I'll show you some of what can be done with it in just a minute. But among other things, what it showed was that virtually every rich person above a certain level of wealth uses the offshore financial system, from Jackie Chan and Emma Watson to just about every head of state you can think of. So this guy up here, he's the late former president of Chile. He was impeached for his use of the offshore financial system because in his country there were certain laws to protect the endangered Humboldt penguin population. But the Humboldt penguins were nesting right next to a very valuable mine. And President Piñera wanted a piece of that for himself and his family. So using offshore accounts, he invested in that illegal mining operation and made a bundle of money, and poor penguins be damned, unfortunately. He was eventually exposed in one of the offshore leaks. This guy, one of the great villains of modern US history, is a hedge fund manager named Robert Mercer. I'll tell you why he's a bad guy in just a minute. At the upper right there, we have former Prime Minister of Czechia, Andrej Babiš, and then President of Kenya, Uhuru Kenyatta, and King Hussein of Jordan, and then Russian President Vladimir Putin, and some of his BFFs. All of these people, and many others, appeared in either the Panama Paradise or the Pandora Papers, which were the big leaks of 2016, 2017, and 2021 respectively, comprising about 7 terabytes of data, which, if that doesn't compute for you guys, is just a Mount Everest of data. Why do those people need secrecy? They're already rich. Well, what they want to do with their wealth is immensely unpopular and they know it, but they want to do it anyways. Like endangering the Humboldt penguins with illegal mining operations. In general, what the people using the offshore financial system want to do isn't just avoidance of paying their taxes. They want to undermine democracy and capitalism and public health and the environment. Basically everything good that keeps us all alive, they want to undermine it. Because it compromises their ability to get a little bit richer and a little bit more powerful. We can talk about that in the Q&A because probably the question bubbling up through some of your heads is like, why isn't enough for these people? You'd think if you were a billionaire, you would just sit on a beach somewhere in a nice library with the drink of your choice and enjoy yourself. You wouldn't be trying to undermine democracy globally, would you? But they do. Why? What a strange way to spend your time. I didn't expect to find this. As I said, I went looking for the sources of global inequality, and I found what I can only describe accurately as a kind of elite insurgency against a lot of what we describe as modernity. Brexit, the 2016 Trump campaign, the careers of most EU populist politicians. Those of you who follow European politics know that there's this group in Germany that's the direct ideological descendant of the Nazi Party, called the AfD, Alternative for Deutschland. There was an equivalent in Austria, an equivalent in Italy, an equivalent in France, and in the UK, and they're all going gangbusters. One of the things that those offshore leaks I told you about have revealed is all of them are funded by offshore money. Why? Because it enables the people who want to destroy democracy to get around national election laws, because you're not supposed to be able to pour billions of dollars in foreign money into sovereign nations' election process. So just to tell you that I'm not making this up, here's what Sebastián Piñera was up to with his offshore accounts, destroying the endangered Humboldt penguins in his own country. Remember, he's not just some rich guy. He's the president. He's entrusted by the people of Chile to look after the best interests of the nation. This is a massive betrayal. Anyone here heard of Peter Thiel? Yeah. He was a year ahead of me at Stanford, and a Hellraiser even used to amuse his dorm mates by talking about the advantages of the apartheid system that he grew up under in Namibia. So what's he up to these days? Well, he's one of the major funding sources for offshore ventures in the world today. And he's not just looking to avoid taxes. For him, that is almost 100% a solved problem. He wants to use offshore for lots of other things to get around the rule of law. So when I talk about undermining democracy, here's a great example. Tuskegee experiment style human medical experiments that are so unethical you can't do them in the US. You can't do them in most countries. So instead of just not doing them at all, what does a billionaire do? A billionaire goes to a small Caribbean island called St. Kitts and Nevis, which is also famous for being a Bitcoin center these days and for selling passports, and says, hey, St. Kitts and Nevis, how about we drop a bunch of money on you? Really, like, chump change as far as Peter Thiel is concerned. And you let us do some totally wildly unethical experiments on human beings involving herpes treatments. And St. Kitts and Nevis doesn't have a big economic base. They don't get enough tourists to survive. There isn't enough fishing or aquaculture to survive. So they say yes to people like Peter Thiel. And this is the case for countries all over the world, especially economically struggling post-colonial nations. This is Marine Le Pen. She's the daughter of one of the most famous French neo-Nazis, recently died. She's carrying his torch forward through what used to be called the Front National. It has a different name now, I always forget what it is. Anyone know what the Front National is called now? National Rally is what it's called. Anyways, she is one of those many European leaders who are funded through offshore accounts. Why? Because a lot of money comes from Putin and the oligarchs. Putin and his Russian oligarchs run the biggest money laundry in the entire world. That's how they remain the richest men in the world. And one of the things they do with that money is that they try to undermine democracy in the West by funding contentious far-right candidates like Le Pen or like this guy. Anyone here read Italian? This is a snarky headline that says, sovereignty fan Matteo Salvini uses the offshore system. So Matteo Salvini is the far-right leader of a political party in Italy called Lega Nord. It's super anti-immigrant, kind of like Brexit in that it's fomenting this idea that like the European Union is a bad thing and Italy should remove itself from it in order to reinstate its sovereignty. But irony of ironies, the guy who loves Italian sovereignty is using offshore financial centers to avoid Italian law. And that, unfortunately, is a very common story. Here's what our very own Robert Mercer did. Robert Mercer, until the early 2000s, was a mild-mannered Mr. Burns-style billionaire. Does anyone know who Mr. Burns is? People stopped watching The Simpsons. So, until the IRS handed him a tax bill for $7 billion in back taxes, Robert Mercer didn't get to anything. He cut a check to the ballet occasionally, or to a local hospital, but he kept a low profile. All of a sudden, he gets a bill for $7 billion and loses his tiny little mind. He decides not only is he going to have the head of the IRS commissioner, he's going to depose the whole government and replace it with people to his liking. So he decides to put $60 million in a series of what the Guardian called war chests in Bermuda. Bermuda is an offshore financial center. And with this, he funds a series of unethical human psychological experiments through an organization called Cambridge Analytica. Anyone here ever heard of it? It changed the world because it scraped Facebook data, unbeknownst to Facebook users, targeted or identified people whose psychological profiles came up as paranoid or vulnerable, psychologically vulnerable to manipulation. And then they set about manipulating them, basically in a very crude way, trying to scare them into voting against their own interests. You may know, if you remember anything about the June 2016 Brexit vote, that it was won by a tiny percentage, about 2% of the population voted for it. And immediately afterwards, you know what the top Google search result in the UK was?
What is Brexit?
What is the EU? So 2% of Brits voted to withdraw themselves from an entity whose nature and purpose they did not understand. Because basically they had been scared out of their minds by this psychological operation. So based on the success of that, Mercer funded the same thing to try to sway voters in the 2016 presidential election. Because as I said, he didn't just want to get the IRS commissioner fired. He wanted to replace the entire federal government and remake it in his image. You can think of it as a dry run for what's happened in 2025. Anyways, there is legitimate debate about how much these Cambridge Analytica shenanigans actually influenced either election, but it's noteworthy that when Cambridge Analytica withdrew this campaign, all of a sudden public opinion in the UK shifted back to, oh, maybe we shouldn't withdraw from the European Union. But by that time it was too late. And now, those of you who follow politics in the UK now, their economy is trashed, their foreign trade is trashed. Businesses can't function because they're basically shut down by the costs of having to pay, well, what social scientists call transaction costs to do business with its biggest trading partner, the European Union. And young people, people your age, are pretty pissed off because they no longer have the right to live and work in Europe freely. They used to have that. Used to be, if you were a British citizen, you could go to university in Denmark or in Spain or in Italy, like any other EU citizen, either tuition-free or low tuition, often with a nice hefty check to pay your expenses. No more, that's over. Here's the reporting on Mercer's manipulation of the Brexit vote and the Trump vote. And to me, as an American who loves democracy, this is the saddest subhead ever. Basically, it says that Robert Mercer has so much money that the Federal Elections Commission cannot contain him. And that is the real danger of offshore finance. It makes the ultra-rich ungovernable. It makes them more powerful than the governments and regulators of any given country. That is why when you see people like Elon Musk raging against multinational institutions like the EU, they hate the EU and they hate NATO, because those are two of the last institutions on the globe that can thwart them in any way. Why? Because they're multinational. People like Musk and Thiel and Mercer have exceeded in power the power of many nation states, even the United States. As I told you, I know about this because I trained to enter the world of offshore finance. I never practiced. I got the credential. It took me 2 years to get it. It was surprisingly hard. I have to admit, I went in there fairly confident. I already had the PhD from Harvard and been a professor for 8 years. I thought, how hard can it be? Well, accounting is really hard, at least for an English major. And investment finance, challenging. Trust law and corporate law, challenging in a pleasant way. As I said, I went looking for the headwaters of global inequality, and I found them, but I also found this other thing, which is much more disturbing. What it got me to earn this credential after 2 years was like the magic ticket to enter Willy Wonka's Magic Kingdom. You can't go to professional society meetings for wealth managers where they spill all the beans about all the shenanigans they're playing with governments of the world. You can't just go there if you pay the fee. You have to have a credential as a wealth manager. So if you really want to hear what's going on and how more or less every regulation and law passed to defeat them can be end run around, you gotta go listen to them brag to each other. And that's what I did. For 15 years, I went all over the world observing and interviewing offshore experts. That's called ethnographic immersion. That's a technique taken from anthropology. It took a long time because it was really expensive and I had to piece together funding from lots of little sources. But I eventually got 70 of these wealth managers to talk to me, which doesn't sound like a lot of people, but when those people are constrained by civil and criminal penalties in some cases, if they accidentally reveal information that could compromise their client's privacy, that's a big deal. In fact, I went into this thinking maybe zero talked to me. What that did was generate propositions that I could test with quantitative data. When I was doing it, the quantitative data didn't exist. But 6 months before my first article got published, Capital Without Borders, which came out in September 2016. In April of 2016, the first really big leak of offshore data by an insider, a whistleblower, came out. And that was like a bomb, but in a positive way. It produced the data I would need to test some of these ideas. So this is where I went, as you can see, all over the world, from names you might recognize, like New York and Zurich, to places like the Cook Islands, which is a tiny island chain between Fiji and Tahiti. All of these places play important roles in the global ecosystem that is offshore finance. They don't necessarily compete head-to-head with one another. It's more like an underwater ecosystem where like this little coral does something and then this little teeny fish does something else, and they all live in harmony. Where things started to get a little surprising is when the wealth managers I interviewed would say things like this to me. So this lady, Erica, she had been an accountant for Greenpeace, which is an international environmental organization. She fell in love with a Swiss guy whose father had a wealth management firm in Switzerland. So she moved to Switzerland and she got a job in the family firm, wealth management. And she said to me, these people, our wealthiest clients, are above the law. They're above nationality and laws. It's potentially very dangerous. She said that to me in 2012. And it's only gotten worse. She wasn't the only one. This guy, Lewis, was an elegant gentleman in London. And he really believed that tax was theft, and he thought of himself as a hero for protecting his billionaire clients from being taxed by rapacious welfare states. But he was the one who first said to me, look, my clients are more powerful than the governments of any country. He started by saying, well, who's more powerful, Procter & Gamble or the government of France? Procter & Gamble, of course. They can sit down their business anywhere in the world that they like, and high net worth individuals are the same way. Meaning, if you try to tax or regulate a rich person, the implicit or sometimes explicit threat is, well, take my money and leave. Or if you're Robert Mercer, I will depose your government and replace it with someone to my liking. That's increasingly the game. Then this guy, whom I call Dieter, not his real name, said to me, he described his clients as what he called a closed shop of wealthy people. That was a very interesting term to use. Does anyone know where the term closed shop comes from? Yeah.
Labor unions?
Union organizing. A closed shop means you can only be a member of this work group if you're a member of a union. So he's describing his billionaire clients as being part of sort of an invisible, informal union. And he says the higher you go up the economic ladder, the smaller the group becomes and the more people know each other. They went to business school together. They've known each other for decades and they talk to each other. So what he's describing there is the social dynamics that would also apply, say, to the Dartmouth Alumni Association. A small group of people, they have important experiences in common, they often end up like living and working in the same places, and they talk to each other, they coordinate. So it's not a conspiracy, it's not being done in secret necessarily, but it's being done in groups of people that most of us would have no access to. The big insight here is that A, there's a relatively small group of people who are using this offshore system. Anyone want to guess how many billionaires there are in the world? Yeah.
700?
3,000, roughly. It hovers right around the 3,000 mark. It's a remarkably small number on a planet of 8 billion plus people, right? Well, the good news is that an even smaller group of wealth managers serve them. As I'll show you in a minute, many wealthy people are kind of paranoid, and they don't just go looking for wealth managers hither and yon. They all use the same wealth managers because only a few of those people are considered trustworthy enough to manage the secrets of the wealth. So that's actually a useful policy insight, because if you want to stop these people, what you have to do is slow down the wealth managers. For decades, all these efforts to constrain wealth inequality and political inequality have been focused on the billionaires themselves, or centimillionaires. That's not necessarily a waste of time, but the big insight from my research is these people don't manage their own money. They can't. If you have wealth spread out all over the world, subject to multiple jurisdictions and laws that are changing over time, even if you did nothing else but manage your money, you could not do it by yourself. You have to have a team of experts do it for you. And so if you target the experts with your policies, you're really hitting at the heart of what makes the rich grow richer at the expense of everyone else and enables them to overwhelm the governments of France or what have you. So what I want to tell you about briefly is how they do it. One way of thinking about wealth management schools is like going to magician school. You learn how to make money disappear. Because once it becomes invisible, it's hard to tax or regulate. In fact, there is a UK wealth management firm whose corporate motto is, I want to be invisible. They are literally selling secrets or secrecy to the rich. And you know how in magic shows, the magician has a rabbit, goes into the hat, and then poof, no more rabbit, and they make it appear somewhere else? That is the essence of what a wealth manager does. Say that I live in a jurisdiction, say New Hampshire, taxes watches at 100% of their value. But I really, really like this watch and I want to wear it. So, Hank, will you be my wealth manager? So let's assume that you live in Vermont and Vermont doesn't tax watches. We can make what's called a trust agreement, where you become the legal owner of my watch, but then I become the beneficial owner of the watch, which means you're liable legally for taxes or any damage my watch might do in the world. But I'm the beneficial owner, which means I get to wear it, but I don't have any legal responsibilities. Now you might think that's absurd, and it is absurd, but it is an 800-year-old tradition that comes from medieval English law. It was a tax dodge by the nobles who didn't want to pay their taxes to the various British kings, and it has survived. In fact, it is a backbone, not just of personal wealth and the offshore system, but of corporate wealth. Do any of you know what a pension fund is, a 401k? Most of the biggest pension funds in the world only run like trusts, like what I just described on that absurd division of ownership. Most corporate bonds are securitized in that way. Do you guys remember the 2008 financial crisis? You were probably in elementary school. This thing happened where banks bundled up mortgages, some of which were like toxic, where the people had no hope of ever paying those mortgages and they were going to go bankrupt. Those are called subprime mortgages. So in order to sell these investment products, these kind of garbage investment products to people, they were also put in an offshore trust structure using the Cayman Islands mostly. So this system I'm describing to you is responsible for most of the economic crashes of the past several decades, as well as this kind of generalized assault on democracy that we're seeing worldwide. So the name of the game, if you want to protect your client's wealth, is you have to make it unclear who owns that wealth. Because if it's unclear who owns it, then it becomes very difficult to tax it or to collect debts on it. So one way to obscure ownership is to do this. This is a picture from one of my wealth management training textbooks, and this is a simple example. Down here at the bottom layer are actual sources of wealth, like a family business, stock portfolio, yacht, or some real estate. I may live in the yacht or on the real estate. I may run the family business, but my legal connection to all those things can be obscured by doing what the British call ring fencing. That means wrapping each of those assets in an individual company, and then taking the company and bundling it, either singly or together with others, into a trust, and then putting the trust into a private trust company or a foundation, and then putting that in either another company or another foundation. And all of these things are in different countries. So that top level entity might be in the Netherlands, and that second level entity might be in Ireland, and maybe this is in the British Virgin Islands, and that one's in the Caymans, and the third one is in Singapore. And all these different companies are also in different jurisdictions. So if you're the tax collector and you think I owe you money on the family business to which my name is attached, it's called Harrington Inc., what you see is that top layer. And you see that a family business exists. But in order to connect me to it, you have to drill down through this maze of structures to link the two. And since each of them is in a different country, that means you have to send lawyers to each of those different countries, which often use different languages, or they have different legal systems. Like maybe it's not like the American and British legal system, which is called common law. Maybe it's civil law, which comes from Roman law. That governs Europe and most of Latin America and other parts of the world. So we're talking very, very expensive lawyers, like $2,000 an hour lawyers. Just making that connection is so prohibitively expensive that many debt collectors, many tax authorities, including our own country's tax authorities, just give up. So if you read a headline in the news that says the IRS disproportionately targets middle class and poor people for audits, this is why. Are you familiar with the term transaction costs? Basically, it's the cost of, it's the friction you can put into getting things done to make it such a pain in the butt that you dissuade people from doing whatever it is that they want to do. Luke knows that my research group is currently working on the patterns by which wealthy people and their wealth managers scatter their assets across different countries, because the pattern looks different if the money comes from Russia versus if it comes from China versus Saudi Arabia versus the US. What that does is it makes it so prohibitively expensive for tax agencies and debt collectors and divorcing spouses and disgruntled heirs and anybody who wants a piece of your wealth, it makes it so costly for them to track down what you really own that they simply give up. This also, from a political science point of view, does an interesting thing. Like, they literally teach you in wealth management school how to exploit conflicts among laws between countries and to identify and exploit gaps in laws, the loopholes. That's why you end up with clients like what Erica described, who treat nations like shopping opportunities. They don't feel constrained by the law the way you or I might. They can go anywhere. They often have multiple passports and citizenship. And of course, their wealth is highly mobile. Our tax systems and many of our legal systems all over the world were designed for a situation in which wealth consisted of land. And you can't really just pick up land and move it around. So it's easier to tax it. You can still play games with it, but at least you can agree that that's the land. When it comes to fungible wealth, which is the source of most billionaires' wealth today, stocks, securities, now crypto, that stuff moves around like at the speed of light. You can't nail it down. And that makes it very hard to tax. Who even has the right to tax it if it's constantly moving between jurisdictions? Have you ever seen the shell game that old-fashioned con artists used to play on city streets? They get either some paper cups or some walnut shells, and there'd be a little tiny ball under one of them, and you'd see it, and then they'd move it around real quick, and you'd have to place a bet on which cup or shell it was under. The shell game. That's essentially what wealth managers are doing with wealth these days. They're moving them around between jurisdictions in different containers like trusts, corporations, and foundations so fast that regulatory entities, sovereign states, can't keep up. And that creates a situation in which, from the point of view of the world's wealthiest people, a nation is like a store in the shopping mall. If you don't find what you like there, you just move on to the next one. With the added perk that you're so rich, you can dictate terms to the store. You can bargain with the store owner. So it's very common for wealth managers, especially for the wealthiest clients, to be intimately involved with the lawmaking processes in some of these offshore centers. What I mean by that is that an offshore center like Singapore might come to a wealth manager and say, hey, Mr. X, we see that you serve a bunch of Chinese billionaires, and we would like more Chinese billionaire money here, so why don't you give us a wish list of what your clients want, and we will pass that into law. Or if the wealth manager is a lawyer by training, they'll say, why don't you draft that as a law and we'll pass it. Multiple people independently bragged to me about having done exactly that. And shockingly, that is coming home to roost in the United States. The governor of Delaware just had this conversation with Elon Musk's lawyers because Facebook got up and left the state of Delaware. You know, Facebook and other big organizations were incorporated in Delaware so they could get some tax breaks. Companies from all over the world use Delaware as their offshore center of preference. But just when Delaware started to impose its very minimal regulations on Facebook, Facebook had a big old hissy fit and said, we're leading. And apparently the new governor of Delaware was afraid that Tesla would do the same thing. So we called a sit down with Elon Musk's lawyers and essentially had the same conversation that the government of Singapore, the government of the Cayman Islands, or St. Kitts and Nevis, or the Cook Islands has with the wealth managers of individual billionaires. What laws do you want us to make? What do we have to do to keep your money here? So that's all very depressing. Now for the good news. This is where the work I've done with Dan Rockmore and Robert Mercer really kicks in. We've taken all of this massive 7 terabytes of data leaked by offshore insiders and looked at the central testable proposition of all my qualitative research, which is the real centers of the offshore financial system are not the rich people, it's the wealth managers. We're talking a few hundred people worldwide who control trillions in wealth. What if we focused on them? We can see it and test it in the 7 terabytes of data. We've got one paper published as of 2 years ago. It's open access, you can see it online. But basically what it says is offshore financial networks, especially wealthy people from authoritarian countries, we looked in particular at Russians and Chinese billionaires. Their offshore networks look just like airline networks. They have a hub and spokes. And you probably know about airline networks that when the hub of an airline network goes down, say O'Hare gets hit by weather, the whole regional network, sometimes the national network goes down with it. But you can apply that insight to the offshore financial system. Network scientists call this super fragility. In general, those hub and spoke networks are very robust. You can attack them lots of ways and they'll keep working. But if you know where the hubs are and you strike those, you can make them fall apart. They don't work anymore. So it turns out that the nodes, the hubs of these offshore networks, especially for billionaires from more kleptocratic or authoritarian countries, are super fragile at the nodes of wealth managers. This, among other things, suggests why decades of sanctions efforts have not really had much of a bite. Do you know in February 22, when the Russians invaded Ukraine again, a lot of Russian oligarchs, Putin's associates, were sanctioned. But they weren't sanctioned for the first time. They've been sanctioned for decades for all kinds of financial crimes, and it hadn't slowed them down. This time, in 2022, they started to sanction the wealth managers, and that really took a bite. So what Herbert and Dan and Mathcroft, Feng Fu and I did was we took a sample from these 7 terabytes of leaked offshore data that included all the oligarchs from Russia who were sanctioned after the 22 invasion of Ukraine. A whole bunch of them were in there, unsurprisingly. That's what the network looks like. You see the hubs and the spokes? Those little yellow guys are the wealth managers. Turns out that all the wealth managers, all the sanctioned Russian oligarchs in that 7 terabytes of data, they're all connected by 124 nodes. For those of you who aren't network scientists, that means a very, very surprisingly small number of nodes. Kind of like what that guy Dieter told me, the wealth manager in Germany. At very high levels, these people talk to each other, they know each other, and I would add, they all use the same wealth managers. That's what we were able to show. So I want you to have a look here. In this case, the light blue dots, the aquamarine dots, are the wealth management organizations. These are sanctioned Russian oligarchs. 3 family members, the Rotenbergs, they're judo partners of Vladimir Putin. Ponomarenko, Kerenov, and Mordashov are also close associates of Putin who are sanctioned. The wealth managers don't just link the oligarchs to their own wealth. They link the oligarchs to each other. So there's this one company called Marcom Management that's central to a lot of the Russian oligarchy. If you were to sanction Marcom Management, you would in one fell swoop cut off a bunch of Russian oligarchs' access to their offshore wealth. Moreover, they're all using the same places, the same physical locations to stash their wealth. For whatever reason, Russian oligarchs really love Cyprus, which is an island in the Mediterranean, and the British Virgin Islands, which is an island in the Caribbean. It's like, you see nature documentaries of the African savannah, and there's an oasis where all the animals come at night to drink. That's what the third floor of the Yamaraj building in the British Virgin Islands is for some Russian oligarchs. So if you wanted to stop them accessing their wealth, that's a place you would want to go. So, without getting into the nitty-gritty quantitative details of this, we did some simulations in which we said, what if we were able to sanction the wealth managers of Russian and Chinese oligarchs? What would happen to their offshore networks? And what these blue and green lines show is that their networks collapse. That's what it means when these lines go towards zero. Effectively, that means if you were able somehow to remove the wealth managers from access to these clients, for example, by sanctioning the wealth managers and saying you can't work with sanctioned oligarchs anymore, you would cut off those oligarchs' access to their offshore wealth, which permits them to do all the damaging things for which they get sanctioned in the first place. So why do we care? This suggests a workable strategy, a new strategy to fight kleptocracy. Sanction the wealth managers. It's actually not making them unable to do their job at all. It just says, wealth managers, practice your profession, but not with sanctioned individuals. This is something that could have been done for decades, but wasn't really tried until 2022, when it really took off. The EU, the US, and the UK all implemented sanctions, not just on individual oligarchs involved in the invasion of Ukraine, they sanctioned the wealth managers for the first time. And that's when the fight really came in. That's when you got Russian oligarchs whining to journalists in the UK and the US about, boo-hoo, now we can't afford our chefs and our drivers, how are we supposed to live? It's pretty funny to read. The legal basis for this is actually about 80 years old. After the Cold War, nuclear scientists, chemical and biological weapons experts were subject to a form of sanction that said, practice your profession, be the scientists you are, but there are certain people in certain countries we've identified that you cannot share your knowledge with. So if you were a nuclear scientist in the 1950s based in the United States, you could not fly to the University of Moscow and give a lecture on your latest discoveries in nuclear science. Remotely. That's a form of sanction. That's what we're talking about. What we're doing now, and what we'll soon be doing with Luke here, is putting to a broader test these very classic, pretty old ideas from sociology about secrecy being the heart of inequality, or what we in the business call stratification. What I want to turn attention to really is not just the people who benefit from that, like the billionaires and the oligarchs, but the gray little functionaries behind the scenes, the experts who make it all happen, because those people are super dangerous. They don't operate like other professions. You know, if you want to be a doctor in this country, you have to get licensed by an individual state. Even if you're licensed in the state of New Hampshire, you can't just walk over to Vermont and practice medicine. No, you have to get licensed there too. That means that if you break the law, if you violate professional ethics, the state has a way to rein you in and protect the public from you. No such thing exists in wealth management anywhere in the world. Any one of you right now can hang up a little shingle outside your door that says wealth manager and nobody can stop you. You can't pretend to be a lawyer or a doctor without running into some legal problems eventually. But you can be a wealth manager. And what that means is, if you help your clients break the law in one country and that country tries to stop you, you just say, see ya, and go to another country. And that's actually a very common career pattern. So one of my current directions of research is studying this group of people called transnational professionals. And by the way, most of the faculty here in this room were transnational professionals too. In fact, if you want to be a world-class physicist, for example, or a world-class economist, you have to be a transnational professional. You can't just stay in Hanover and publish great stuff. You have to go to different places. Another new direction is via this NSF grant I got about 8 months ago that I'm waiting every day to get an Instagram from Doge saying it's been canceled because it uses the word inequality. But with Luke's help, with the help of Herbert Chang and Dan Rockmore, we're looking at globally the patterns of oligarchs' offshore networks, and we're gonna try and fold in all kinds of fun stuff like their private jet and yacht patterns to see how their social movements line up with the movements of their money. And I'm guest editing a special issue of a journal for anyone here who might want to contribute to that, just on this subject. If you want to read more, these are my 2 books on offshore finance. With that, I will leave the floor open to questions.
Questions for Professor Harrington?
Hi, thank you very much. I'm curious about the classic Marxist hypothesis about sort of these oligarchs, which would be, you talked about mostly right-wing oligarchs in terms of the rise of right-wing populism. I'm curious how it breaks down politically and whether the intuition that we get from Marx, which is that really it's these people working together, that both political parties controlling it.
Well, the kind of people who use the offshore system seem to either by self-selection or by the experience of being wealthy, put themselves in the offshore financial system and become more right-wing. So I don't know if George Soros uses the offshore financial system, but his name has never come up in any of the offshore leagues. The people who are known as more progressive, rich people, their names never come up in the offshore leagues. That doesn't mean they don't use the offshore system. There's still a lot we don't know, kind of like that funny map from 1493 I showed you. So maybe one day we'll discover that indeed every single person who's a billionaire is using the offshore system. But so far it seems like there's a very tight correlation between offshore use and right-wing political views. And because of what that wealth manager Dieter told me, one of the things that's unclear is the direction of causality. Are you using the offshore system because you fundamentally hate the idea that any government anywhere would constrain you by expecting you to obey the law, whether it's tax law or the law that says you're supposed to pay your debts or obey environmental regulations? Or do you use the offshore system because some lawyer advises you to do it, and then you end up hanging out with people who believe the welfare state is rapacious and illegitimate, and then you shift rightward? The latter seems to be the case with Mark Andreessen, who, by all accounts, people who knew him personally, was kind of a normal guy, just like a grad student at the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana. He invented one of the world's first web browsers called Mosaic, and now he is completely off the deep end, writing things like, he just published a manifesto about a year and a half ago about how we all have to become like super spacemen. I'm not kidding.
Is the current research that you're doing still based off of the old leaks? And then if so, like, can the oligarchs and other kleptocrats move around their money, which would then kind of prevent all of this research from being applied, like prevent the wealth managers from being sanctioned because they're at a new wealth manager? And how does that work?
Okay, so the leaks keep happening. The most recent one is about 3.5 years old. So 2016, 2017, 2021. The thing about wealth managers is you don't just switch easily. They're sticky, those relationships are sticky. And so I have lots of people telling me in my books, my wealth management firm has served 3 generations of one family. Or I'm serving the clients that my father served 50 years ago. Why? You ever seen the Godfather movie? Okay, you know who Tom Hagen was, the Irish-German attorney who literally knows where the bodies are buried for the Corleone mafia family? And if anyone here has not seen the Godfather movies but wants to, plug your ears right now because there's going to be a spoiler. It's Tom Hagen who puts the horse's head in the Hollywood producer's bed. You know, he knows all the dirty secrets. In fact, the Godfather wants to adopt Tom Hagen and make him officially a member of the family because he knows where all the bodies are buried. Those relationships are not what's called fungible. They're not transferable. The same thing happens in lots of service provider relationships for rich people. I don't know if you read like Us or People or follow any of the celebrity gossip rags, but like all the it figures go to the same stylists, they get the same hairdressers, they use the same nannies. Why? Because only a handful of people can be trusted not to sell pictures of you, with mascara smeared all over your face and your hair in a bun to the tabloids. They can make a fortune selling you out. Only a very small number of people can be trusted. And those people get sort of passed around among the rich and famous in very tight circles. So that's why, even though we're looking at the past of wealth managers' constructions in the offshore world, what we're not trying to do is say, oh, Mr. X has constructed the British Virgin Islands. We're not chasing Mr. X. We're looking at like, what do kleptocrats do as a group offshore? And while the actual locations of their structures may change, it's unlikely that their wealth managers will change for the reasons I just gave you. And like, there are only a few basic structures you can even use offshore. It's like Legos, you just have like a few simple pieces you can use to build an infinite variety of things. Trust foundations and corporations are the Lego pieces of offshore. So you're always going to find those three things in varying combinations. We know what to look for. What we're interested in is not any one individual's use, but the pattern overall, like by country, for example. You, sir, and then
Yeah, thank you for your talk. I was pretty interested, like on those graphs you showed, by the iteratively like removing certain like focal points, how those can simulate kind of the deconstruction of the network. And you talk about these relationships as not being fungible right now, but with this like, I guess, rise of new knowledge and like the work that you're doing, how do you see these relationships evolving over time? And do these manager positions become fungible due to like, if you are actively engaging with or like restricting certain managers' functions or who they can be working with? What do you perceive as going to be the like reactionary effect of like other wealth managers, and is that just going to be constantly evolving? You're always like chasing something, or
what's being chased is not the wealth manager, but the jurisdiction. So, Switzerland used to be the go-to place to hide your money, but then the U.S. decided that too many Americans were hiding their wealth from U.S. tax authorities in Switzerland, and they got this close to starting a war with Switzerland. They were threatening military action, and Switzerland backed down and said, okay, we're going to basically stop accepting American clients, we'll give you the data on Americans who are using Switzerland. And so a whole bunch of wealthy people, not just from America, but everywhere, decided that Switzerland wasn't a safe bet anymore, and they moved their business, and the wealth managers moved too, out of Switzerland to other more secretive jurisdictions, notably Singapore, which has much tighter rules. So the wealth managers themselves pick up and move to jurisdictions depending on what levels of secrecy they offer. The US is becoming one of those places now. The Trump administration killed some laws that would have made this kind of activity more transparent and would have required more disclosure. And the US under the Obama administration decided not to sign on to something called the Common Reporting Standard, which was the effort by the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which includes the US and most of the wealthiest countries in the world. They all shared an interest in wanting to shut down elite tax evasion as much as possible. So they all signed on, except the US, to this agreement that said we will share tax information about nationals of your country with each other. So France is a signatory to the CRS. If someone comes to France and tries to hide their money from the government of Germany, France will give up that otherwise confidential information to Germany. But the US said, we don't need to sign that. And so tons of money came to the US and tons of wealth managers came to the US with it. The US makes a lot of money off of being, in a game theoretic sense, a defector from this cooperative international movement. Yes?
This might be like a tinfoil hatty question, but we were mentioning that like Teal and some of these like heads of state like do things against the interests of like the environment and like so were you ever like in a position where it could be like potentially dangerous? I mean, so like really expose these secrets of the ultra rich, and how do you get some people to talk to you with the like, I don't know, like weight and stakes of the like operation going on?
Okay, so there are kind of two questions there. Is it dangerous? Yes. Journalists are really on the front lines of this, and numerous journalists have been murdered for doing this. I haven't really exposed any particular person, I've exposed a system, and so I don't think anyone in particular has a grudge against me. But I have been threatened, I write about it in Offshore. There are dangers to what I've done, especially as a woman traveling alone to some pretty remote corners of the world. I've been threatened with deportation, I get all kinds of death and rape threats and, you know. And by the way, Dartmouth offers zero by way of protection from any of this. I have to pay for it all myself, like a service to keep my home address and my phone number out of public records and security and stuff like that. It's really scary. It's worth doing though, and I'm in much less danger than journalists are. The second part of your question, why do people talk to me? I didn't go undercover. At all times when I was talking to wealth managers, they knew my real name and they knew my real affiliation. I told them I was a sociologist, I told them I was interested in the mechanics of what they did as wealth managers. As for why they talked to me, one is they probably thought I was harmless. You know, one of the advantages of being a woman in an all-male or nearly all-male environment is no one thinks you're smart enough to be harmful. And they like to explain things to you. I didn't set out to manipulate anyone, but like remember, part of this research I was doing while I was like 8 months pregnant. So there's nothing less dangerous looking than a waddling lady going, tell me about your job. Nobody thought I was going to be a danger to them until I started publishing. The very first article I published in Academic Journal, I showed up to talk to an accountant in the British Virgin Islands, and he sat down and he said to me, "Are you a Marxist?" Hi! No, I don't think so. Why? Well, you published this article that has the word inequality in the title. I'm like, oh my god, someone besides my mom read it! How great! Because, you know, academic journals, especially this one, is not known for having a massive readership. But this guy had Googled me and he found that I published an article that had the inflammatory title, Offshore, basically wealth management and its contribution to inequality. You know, ooh, big deal, right? This man totally freaked out about it. He threatened me with deportation. He alluded to all kinds of like nefarious powers. Momentarily, I thought he was having a psychotic break because he was an accountant. Like, what would he possibly have to do with deportation? So I sort of pacified it, and then I went back to my hotel and I had a stiff drink because he kind of rattled me. And I started Googling myself, and I found a case 2 years in the past where a journalist who had been investigating child abuse in a well-known offshore financial center called Jersey, which is in the Channel Islands between the UK and France. She'd just been studying an orphanage where children had been abused, but the good burgers of Jersey decided that that story getting out could hurt their business and make rich people not want to put their money there. So they had her arrested, interrogated for 2 hours, deported, and forbidden entry to the entire United Kingdom and the Channel Islands for 2 years. Basically, they wanted to like strike the fear of God into her and shut down her story. So I realized that, wow, this wealth management industry is a bit more powerful than I realized. And other scary things happened, but you know, I'm still here and safely squirreled away in Hanover, where nobody really notices me, at least for the time being. So I hope it'll stay that way. Someone over here has a question.
I had a very similar question you kind of so.
Okay. Yes, sir.
I'm curious about the role, if any, that like the really large wealth managers, like the UBS or like the HSBCs of the world, that they have in like maybe serving as like a training ground for some of these people.
Sometimes, I'm glad you raised that because there's sort of a pyramidal structure in this wealth management industry. I'll use a fashion metaphor. You know, up at the very pinnacle of fashion, there's something called haute couture, which is what you see walking down the runway and in Vogue magazine. So a haute couture dress designed by Oscar de la Renta's dad, but someone like that. That might run you $40,000, but it's made to your body, just the way you want it. If you can't afford that, there's a very small number of people who can't afford it. The next level down is called pret-a-porter, and there you get sort of semi-customized clothing. And then another layer down from that for people who are maybe upper middle class but not rich is called off the rack. So that's when you walk into a Macy's and you find socks in the men's section that have the name Christian Dior on them. Like Christian Dior didn't make the socks for you. Wealth management is a lot like that. If you're super rich, like if you have maybe 50 million or more in investable assets, you get the haute couture version of wealth management, where you get like one wealth manager, maybe a team of them dedicated to you and you alone. You don't share them with anyone. The next level down, the sort of pret-a-porter level, say you have $20 to $50 million in investable assets. You share a wealth manager from a boutique firm like Rothschild Bank or Julius Baer. And maybe that wealth manager has 4 or 5 clients, but that person is going to take a phone call from you at 2 in the morning, no matter what. Maybe they come to your kid's wedding. Down at the bottom level, you can march on down to Bank of America on Main Street, and they'll tell you that they're going to offer you wealth management, but it's nothing like what I just described here. They're not going to do anything offshore for you. It's sort of a label. Because it's unregulated, it's kind of a label they can put on anything, like supplements you might see at a GNC. They can promise you anything, and there's no one to say, no, it doesn't really do that. So what UBS or HSBC offers to clients might be somewhere in between the sort of ready-to-wear and pret-a-porter levels. So you might be like moderately rich. Maybe you've got $5 million in investable assets, and HSBC gives you a wealth manager that you share with like 20 other people. You get some good advice, but it's probably going to help HSBC more than it helps you.
Time for maybe one more question, if there's one.
You probably had a better question than me, so.
I mean, not necessarily.
Okay, this is not fully formed, so you just.
Okay, I guess just looking at the current, federal administration, where do you think the US can go to better, target this kind of, wealth management manipulation? And if you think there's any hope right now, or if we have to wait a little bit, or if there's any politicians out there that are, putting out legislation to, target this?
Jamie Raskin has been very active in this space, so Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island. To a lesser extent, Elizabeth Warren, but she's more focused on domestic issues. But I'd say Sheldon Whitehouse and Jamie Raskin are the 2 congressional leaders who are most aware of the international dimension of all of this. But a lot of other congressional representatives and state governors are very much in on the game. Like South Dakota wants to keep being America's most popular wealth management site for foreign oligarchs. Did you know that? South Dakota and Wyoming are basically acting like poor little post-colonial states because they too don't have much of an economic base. It's not a coincidence that it's the states like South Dakota and Wyoming and Delaware, Delaware is quite small. They don't have much going on economically, except as places that capital can go hide out from the state, either corporate capital or private capital. So under this administration, I think the chances are 0 that there would be any reform on this. On the contrary, I mean, you've got Donald Trump trying to sell $500,000 golden visa citizenship deals for people. That's what offshore financial centers like Cyprus have been doing, what Malta has been doing. The most corrupt offshore financial centers in the world have been running the kind of scams that Donald Trump is personally backing in the press right now. It's shocking to see it. If you really want to get into the weeds of this, anyone here ever heard of Aimé Césaire, the Martinican poet and politician? Right. You know about the imperial boomerang? So Aimé Césaire, way back in about 1950, wrote a little tiny book that I recommend to all of you who are a pamphlet of anything called Discourse on Colonialism. He was a visionary, so 15 years before the real decolonizing movement started. Like India had just shaken off the British Empire 5 years previously, but there were still a lot of dominoes to fall. But Aimé Césaire was like, okay, here's what happens in colonialism. All these civilizing empires, they come along to India or to Africa or to Asia or Latin America or North America for that matter, and they say, we're gonna civilize these poor savages. But what they actually end up doing is savagery themselves, and what goes around comes around. That's what the imperial boomerang is, he says. Whenever an empire commits savagery against the people it colonizes, inevitably, all of that savagery comes back. The murder and the exploitation and the expropriation, it comes back to the empire itself. And so one way of thinking about what Donald Trump represents and all the weird financial stuff he's trying to do is it's the imperial boomerang swinging around to smack us right in the face. Because he is acting like the heads of state of Cyprus, of Malta, not only of offshore financial centers, but of the sleaziest offshore financial centers in the world. And by the way, his name turns up a lot in the papers, I think 3,000 times.
On that note, thank you very much.